There are moments in life when everything looks the same on the surface, yet something inside us is quietly breaking. Not with noise, not with drama, but with the slow weight of holding on too long. We cling to memories, to plans that didn't survive reality, to versions of ourselves that no longer fit. And we call it loyalty. We call it strength. But sometimes the heaviest burden isn't failure, it's refusal. This story is about why healing doesn't begin when things improve. It begins when we finally release what was never meant to stay. In a quiet town where seasons mattered more than speed, there lived a man named Elias Moore. He was a gardener by trade, and like the soil he worked with, he believed that holding on was the same as caring. He was wrong, and that realization changed everything. Elias Moore woke before the sun, not because an alarm demanded it, but because his body no longer remembered how to rest. Morning arrived quietly in his small town, sliding in through thin curtains and settling on the wooden floor like a promise no one had spoken aloud. Elias rose from his bed the same way he had for years, without hesitation, without reflection, as if stopping to think might invite doubt. Outside, the garden waited. It always did. Rows of soil stretched neatly across the land behind his modest house, each line precise, intentional, controlled. Elias liked it that way. Disorder unsettled him. He believed that if something was cared for deeply enough, it would never leave. If you showed up every day, pulled every weed, measured every inch, nothing would fall apart. That belief shaped everything about him. He moved through the garden slowly, fingers brushing leaves, eyes scanning for imperfections. A wilted stem here, dry soil there. He corrected each one immediately, kneeling down, pressing earth back into place with firm hands. The soil resisted slightly, then gave in. It always did. To Elias, this was peace. The townspeople admired him. They called him disciplined, dependable, someone you could count on. His garden produced the best vegetables for miles, and his advice was often sought, rarely questioned. He never bragged. He didn't need to. The results spoke for him. But beneath the calm rhythm of his days lived an unspoken tension. Elias didn't just tend the garden. He guarded it. He hovered. He checked the same rows twice, sometimes 3 times, even when nothing had changed. Growth, to him, wasn't something to trust. It was something to manage. In the quiet moments when the wind moved through the leaves and the world felt briefly out of reach, Elias felt something tighten in his chest, a subtle fear, not loud enough to name, but strong enough to guide him. If he loosened his grip, something would be lost. He had learned that lesson long ago, though he rarely allowed himself to remember when. Loss in his mind came from negligence, from letting go too soon, from believing things could survive without constant attention. So, he held on. He held on to routines that no longer nourished him, to memories that had already finished speaking, to versions of himself that had once been necessary but now felt heavy. Elias told himself this was strength. He told himself that patience meant endurance without release, that discipline meant never stepping back, that letting go was just another word for quitting. And standing there in the early morning light, dirt beneath his nails, back slightly bent from years of careful control, Elias Moore believed, truly believed, that if he could just hold the soil tightly enough, nothing important would ever leave him. He didn't yet understand that some things don't need to be held. They need space. As the weeks passed, the garden responded the way it always had, obediently. Green pushed through brown. Leaves widened. Roots strengthened beneath the surface, unseen but dependable. Elias watched it all with quiet satisfaction, the kind that doesn't smile but settles deep in the chest like proof. This was what effort looked like. Each day followed the same rhythm. Wake early, walk the rows, adjust, correct, improve. He measured progress not in feelings but in yield. The more the garden flourished, the more certain he felt that his way was right. Discipline, after all, had never failed him before. People came more often now. Neighbors stopped by to ask how he kept the soil so rich, how he knew exactly when to water, when to prune, when to wait. Elias answered simply. He spoke about consistency, about patience, about never abandoning something just because it became difficult. They nodded. They admired him. Some even envied his calm. What they didn't see was how tightly he carried that calm within himself, like something fragile that might shatter if he loosened his grip. At night, Elias sat at his small kitchen table, hands wrapped around a warm mug, staring out at the darkened garden. Even in rest, his mind walked the rows. He replayed the day, searching for mistakes that hadn't happened. He planned tomorrow before today had finished breathing. Still, he told himself this was devotion. The harvest that year was generous. Baskets filled quickly. The town market praised his produce. His name became familiar beyond the boundaries of his land. Success, by all visible measures, had arrived. Yet something inside Elias remained unmoved. He felt no lightness, no relief, only the quiet pressure to maintain. Success didn't soften him, it tightened him, because now there was more to lose. He doubled his effort without realizing it. Woke earlier, stayed longer. He trimmed plants that didn't need trimming, watered soil that still held moisture. He corrected growth that might have found its own way had he allowed it. In the name of care, he began to interfere, and the garden, still generous, still patient, absorbed it. For now. Elias mistook this tolerance for approval. He believed the seasons rewarded effort alone, never questioning whether they also required surrender. To him, growth was something you earned through control, not something that unfolded naturally. On a warm afternoon, as the sun hovered low and the air smelled faintly of earth and green life, Elias paused at the edge of the garden. For a brief moment, he considered sitting down, just sitting, letting the wind move through the leaves without intervention. The thought made him uneasy. Rest felt irresponsible. Distance felt dangerous. So he picked up his tools again. What Elias didn't realize was that this season, the one filled with effort, recognition, and visible success, was quietly setting the stage for imbalance. The soil was growing compacted. The roots were adapting to constant interference. The garden was learning to depend on him too much, and so was he. Because when success is built on never letting go, it carries a hidden cost. It leaves no room for change. The failure didn't arrive all at once. It came quietly, the way most losses do, without ceremony, without warning, without asking whether Elias felt ready. At first it was subtle. A patch of soil that stayed damp too long. Leaves that curled when they should have stretched. Growth that slowed, not enough to alarm, just enough to whisper that something was different. Elias noticed, of course. He always did. He adjusted immediately, changed the watering schedule, tested the soil, worked longer hours under a sun that felt harsher than usual. He told himself it was just a difficult stretch, an unusual season, nothing more. Gardens had moods after all. They faltered sometimes, but this time effort didn't bring correction. The plants didn't respond the way they used to. Roots tangled instead of deepening. Stems weakened. Fruits ripened unevenly, some too early, others not at all. The balance Elias had relied on for years slipped away, refusing to be pulled back into place. Then came the storm. It wasn't dramatic. No violent winds, no destruction that made headlines. Just days of relentless rain that soaked the land beyond its limit. The soil, already tight from years of constant tending, couldn't breathe. Water pooled. Roots drowned. When the sky finally cleared, Elias walked the rows in silence. What he saw stopped him. Entire sections of the garden had collapsed. Plants leaned at unnatural angles. Leaves yellowed, heavy with decay. The soil, once obedient, now felt dense and unyielding beneath his fingers. For the first time in years, Elias didn't know what to do. He knelt down, pressing the earth the way he always had, but it resisted. The more he pushed, the harder it became. His hands, so familiar with correction, suddenly felt useless. The loss wasn't just agricultural, it was personal. The garden had been his proof that discipline worked, that holding on prevented failure, that effort guaranteed outcome. And now, standing in the middle of what he could not fix, Elias felt something crack inside him. Not anger, not panic, but disbelief. He returned home early that day. The tools remained untouched by the door. He sat at the kitchen table as daylight faded, staring at nothing, his hands still stained with dirt that no longer felt grounding. That night, sleep didn't come. His mind replayed every decision, every adjustment, every moment he might have loosened his grip but chose not to. He searched for the mistake that had caused this, convinced there must be one clear failure he could correct. Because if he could name the error, he could undo the loss. But the truth was harder. Nothing had gone wrong all at once. The garden hadn't failed him. It had simply reached the limit of being held too tightly. And Elias, for the first time in his life, was forced to face a reality he had avoided for years. That control, no matter how disciplined, could not protect him from everything. Some things fall apart, not because we didn't care enough, but because we cared without letting go. Elias refused to believe that what he saw was final. The garden still stood. The soil was still there. The seasons had not ended. To him, that meant the story wasn't over. It couldn't be. Loss in his mind was only temporary if effort remained constant. So he returned the next morning with renewed determination, as though sheer will might reverse what had already begun. He worked harder than ever. He dug deeper, breaking apart soil that no longer welcomed his hands. He replanted where plants had collapsed, pressing new roots into earth that was still too tight to receive them. He corrected, adjusted, hovered, repeating the same rituals that had once brought success. Denial disguised itself as discipline. Neighbors noticed the change. Elias no longer greeted them with quiet nods. He barely spoke at the market. When asked about the damaged crops, he brushed it off, insisting the next cycle would be better. He said it confidently, not because he believed it, but because believing otherwise felt dangerous. Admitting loss would mean admitting limits. And Elias had built his entire life on the belief that limits were for those who gave up too soon. At night he stayed awake replaying the past, not with grief, but with obsession. He remembered earlier seasons, earlier harvests, earlier versions of himself, moments when everything had worked because he had held on harder. He clung to those memories like instructions, convinced they still applied. But the garden was no longer listening. The soil resisted every attempt to reshape it. New plants struggled, their leaves pale, their growth hesitant. Instead of thriving, the land seemed to recoil from his touch. Still, Elias pressed on. Rest felt like surrender. Pausing felt like betrayal of the garden, of his identity, of the years he had invested. He told himself that persistence was noble, that quitting was the real danger, that letting go was a weakness dressed up as wisdom. What he didn't see was how exhaustion was reshaping him. His movements grew sharp, his patience thinned. The quiet joy he once felt in the early mornings was gone, replaced by urgency. He wasn't tending anymore. He was fighting, and the field bore the weight of that fight. One evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the damaged rows, Elias stood at the edge of the garden, breathing heavily. His hands trembled slightly, though he didn't notice. He looked over the land, searching for signs of improvement, of reward, of validation. There were none, only emptiness where abundance had once been. And still, he couldn't step away, because walking away would force him to feel what he had been avoiding. Not just the loss of the harvest, but the deeper truth that some things end no matter how tightly we hold them. So Elias stayed, working a field that was asking for rest, holding on to a past that could not return, refusing to see that the emptiness before him was not punishment, but an invitation. Winter arrived without announcement. One morning, Elias stepped outside and felt it, the sharp stillness in the air, the way sound seemed to retreat. The garden lay motionless, stripped of color, stripped of resistance. What little remained stood brittle and bare, as if even the land had grown tired of trying. There was nothing left to fix. At first Elias wandered the rows out of habit, boots pressing softly into frozen ground. His hands stayed in his pockets. The tools remained inside. For the first time in years, the garden offered him no task, no distraction, no proof of worth. The silence unsettled him more than the failure ever had. Without work to anchor his days, time expanded uncomfortably. Mornings stretched, evenings lingered. Elias found himself sitting at the kitchen table long after meals were finished, staring at the same view he had once watched with pride. Now it felt distant. The town moved on quietly. The market stalls adjusted. People found other sources, other rhythms. No one blamed it. No one accused him. Their acceptance, strangely, made the loss heavier. Isolation crept in slowly. Elias stopped attending the market altogether. He declined invitations with polite excuses that soon faded into silence. Conversations required energy he no longer had. Explaining felt pointless when he couldn't explain things to himself. In the stillness, thoughts surfaced that effort had long kept buried. Questions he had avoided, regrets he had postponed. An ache that had nothing to do with soil or seasons. At night, sleep came in fragments. He dreamed of the garden as it once was, lush and forgiving, only to wake to the sound of wind against bare branches. The contrast felt cruel, but honest. For the first time, Elias allowed himself to stop reaching, not because he had chosen to, but because he had nothing left to grasp. Days passed without distinction. He began taking long walks through the town, not to be seen, but to feel less invisible. He sat on benches he had never noticed before, watching people pass, noticing how life continued without urgency, without control. Something about that unsettled him. One afternoon, snow began to fall lightly, settling over the land like a quiet apology. Elias stood at the edge of the garden and watched it disappear beneath white. The damage, the effort, the failure, all softened, blurred, made temporarily irrelevant. He felt a heaviness in his chest, not sharp, not overwhelming, just deep. This was the lowest point, though he didn't name it that way. Not yet. It was the moment when distraction was gone, when silence spoke louder than effort ever had, when he could no longer pretend that holding on had saved him from pain. Because in the quietest winter of his life, Elias Moore finally faced the truth he had been avoiding. Loss doesn't always demand action. Sometimes it demands stillness. Elias noticed the bench before he noticed her. It sat near the edge of the town square, weathered and uneven, its paint worn thin by years of use. He had passed it countless times without stopping. That morning, however, his legs carried him there without intention, as if the stillness of winter had quietly rearranged his habits. He sat down slowly, feeling the cold seep through his coat. For a while, he watched the square breathe. A few people crossed it with measured steps. A dog tugged eagerly at its leash. Nothing remarkable happened, and yet Elias felt strangely anchored by the ordinary movement of life. Then she spoke. "You look like someone who used to be busy." Her voice was calm, neither curious nor intrusive. Elias turned to see an elderly woman seated at the far end of the bench. Her posture was relaxed, her gaze resting on the open space ahead, not on him. "I suppose I was," Elias replied after a pause. She nodded, as if confirming something she already knew. "I come here every morning," she said, "not to do anything, just to sit." Elias shifted uncomfortably. Doing nothing had never felt productive to him. Still, something in her presence kept him from standing up and leaving. "They removed a tree from this square years ago," she continued, pointing to an empty patch of ground nearby. "It was old, sick. People complained that it made the place look unfinished." Elias followed her gesture, seeing only bare ground dusted with snow. "I was angry when they cut it down," she said softly. "I thought they'd taken something from me." "And did they?" Elias asked. She smiled, small and knowing. "No, they gave the ground time." She explained how the space had changed, how sunlight reached new corners, how people gathered differently, how something lighter had replaced what once stood there. The square had not become poorer, it had become open. Elias felt the words settle slowly. "I spent years trying to protect that tree," she added. "Watering it, defending it, pretending it could stay forever if I cared enough." She finally turned to look at him. "Some things don't need protection," she said. "They need permission to end." The simplicity of the sentence struck him harder than any lecture could have. They sat in silence after that. No advice followed, no instructions, just the sound of wind moving through the square, through the open space where something once stood. When Elias eventually rose to leave, he felt lighter, not because his pain was gone, but because it no longer demanded resistance. The old woman remained on the bench, exactly as she had been, offering nothing more than presence. As Elias walked away, he realized something profound. Letting go was not an act of abandonment. It was an act of trust. Elias did not return to the garden the next morning. The decision wasn't dramatic. There was no declaration, no moment of resolve. He simply woke, sat on the edge of his bed, and felt no urgency to rush outside. The stillness that followed surprised him. It didn't feel like failure. It felt unfamiliar and strangely honest. When he eventually stepped onto the land later that day, he carried no tools. The garden looked much the same as it had in winter's grip. Quiet, bare, resting. Elias walked slowly between the rows, noticing how the soil had softened under weeks of neglect. Not decay. Recovery. For the first time, he didn't kneel to correct. He stood back. That small act, choosing distance, felt heavier than any labor he had ever done. Every instinct urged him to intervene, to shape, to control, but the old woman's words echoed gently in his mind. They need permission to end. So Elias began with subtraction. He removed dead plants instead of forcing new ones in their place. He loosened compacted soil without reshaping it. He allowed certain sections to remain empty, resisting the urge to fill every gap. Space, he realized, was not waste. It was preparation. His days shifted quietly. Mornings became slower. He learned to stop when fatigue appeared, rather than pushing past it. He listened more, to the weather, to his own breath, to the subtle signals he had ignored for years. Discipline remained, but its shape changed. It was no longer about constant action. It was about restraint. Elias found himself sitting more often, on the steps of his house, on the edge of the field, sometimes even on that familiar bench in the town square. He didn't search for the old woman. He didn't need to. Her lesson had already taken root. Some days, doubt crept in. He wondered if he was being careless, if this new gentleness was simply avoidance dressed up as wisdom. Old habits tugged at him, whispering that effort was safety, that rest invited loss. But each time he returned to the garden, he saw subtle change. The soil breathed, water absorbed evenly. Nothing rushed, and nothing resisted. Elias began to feel the same shift within himself. Memories still surfaced, but they no longer demanded obedience. Regret still appeared, but it passed without tightening his chest. He was learning, slowly, imperfectly, that healing didn't require erasing the past. It required releasing its grip. By leaving space in the earth, Elias was learning to leave space in his life. Space for uncertainty. Space for rest. Space for growth he did not need to supervise. And for the first time in a long while, he felt something new stirring beneath the surface. Not control, not fear, but trust. Change, Elias learned, does not announce itself as permanent. It tests you quietly, just as the first signs of renewal appeared in the garden, faint green breaking through softened soil. Something old stirred within him, a familiar restlessness, a whisper that asked whether he had gone too far in the other direction. One morning he noticed a section where growth seemed uneven, not failing, just imperfect. The sight unsettled him more than he expected. His body reacted before his mind did, shoulders tightening, breath shortening, hands itching for tools. This was where he used to intervene. The temptation felt reasonable, responsible even. After all, wasn't care still important? Wasn't attention what had made him successful before? Elias stood there longer than necessary, arguing with himself in silence. Old habits returned not as enemies but as memories of comfort. He remembered the certainty of control, the reassurance of action, the way effort once gave him identity. Letting go had brought peace, but peace felt fragile, unproven. Doubt found its opening. That afternoon he worked longer than he intended, adjusted more than was needed. The old rhythm slipped back into place with unsettling ease, and with it came exhaustion, familiar, sharp, immediate. That night, Elias lay awake, staring at the ceiling, heart heavy. He realized then that transformation was not about erasing who he had been. It was about choosing differently when the same urge returned. The next day he returned to the uneven patch and stopped. He set his tools down. Instead of fixing, he observed. Instead of correcting, he waited. He reminded himself that uneven did not mean wrong, and discomfort did not mean danger. Days passed. The section he had worried over began to settle on its own. Growth balanced out naturally, without force. The soil adjusted, roots finding space Elias would never have thought to create. The lesson was quiet, but unmistakable. Strength, he understood, wasn't proven in dramatic moments of change. It was proven in repetition, in resisting the familiar pull of old roots. Elias began to trust himself in a new way, not as someone who never felt the urge to control, but as someone who could notice that urge without obeying it. This was harder than any labor he had known. There was no applause for restraint, no visible reward for patience, no immediate proof that he was doing the right thing, only peace that deepened slowly. And as the garden continued to grow, not perfectly, not predictably, but freely, Elias felt a quiet pride emerge, not in the outcome, but in his consistency, because letting go, he now knew, was not a single act. It was a discipline practiced daily. Spring returned gently, as if careful not to demand too much. The garden no longer felt like something Elias managed. It felt like something he accompanied. He walked the rows without urgency, noticing growth the way one notices breath, present, steady, requiring no instruction. Plants rose at different heights now. Some leaned, some took their time. The symmetry Elias once enforced had softened into something more honest, and instead of unsettling him, it brought a quiet sense of ease. The garden was no longer a reflection of control, it was a reflection of trust. Elias found himself smiling more often, not from pride, but from appreciation. Each morning felt less like a responsibility and more like an invitation. He no longer measured success by fullness alone, but by balance, by how the land responded when given space. Purpose returned, but it had changed shape. It was no longer tied to outcomes or approval. It lived in presence, in care without possession, in showing up without gripping too tightly. People noticed. They remarked on the calm he carried, the way he listened now without planning his next task. He spoke less about technique and more about timing, about knowing when to step in and when to step back. Elias realized that gratitude had crept into his life without effort. Gratitude for what remained, gratitude for what had ended, gratitude for the winter that had forced him to stop. The garden thrived in its own way, not as abundant as before, but more resilient. Loss had refined it. So had release. One afternoon, Elias sat at the edge of the field and watched the wind move through the leaves. Nothing demanded correction. Nothing asked for more. He felt complete. Not because everything was perfect, but because nothing was being resisted. This was the new dawn. Not loud, not triumphant, just steady. Elias understood now that purpose was not something to be achieved and defended. It was something that emerged when you stopped fighting the natural rhythm of change. The garden grew, and so did he. And now this part of the story belongs to you. Because somewhere in your life, there is a field you've been holding too tightly. A role, a relationship, a version of yourself that once kept you safe, but now keeps you stuck. Elias learned what many of us learn too late, that effort is not the same as wisdom, and discipline without release becomes another form of fear. The soil taught him what no success ever did, that growth cannot happen where there is no space. Letting go does not mean you failed. It means you understood the season had changed. Some things leave not because you were careless, but because they had already given you what they came to give. Holding on longer only hardens the ground. Releasing them softens it. You don't need to erase your past to heal. You don't need to punish yourself for what ended. You only need to stop gripping what no longer grows. There is strength in restraint. There is courage in stepping back. There is discipline in choosing peace over control. When you allow space, life fills it. Not always the way you expect, but often in the way you need. Purpose doesn't disappear when something ends. It transforms. It shifts. It waits patiently for you to notice. If you are in a season of loss, don't rush to fix it. If you are in a season of silence, don't fear it. If you are in a season of change, don't resist it. Winter is not the enemy of growth. It is the reason growth returns. Elias Moore did not become wiser by adding more effort to his life. He became wiser by learning when effort was no longer required. And in that release, he found something quieter than success, something deeper, peace. So, ask yourself gently, what would happen if you loosened your grip? What might grow if you left a little space? If this story spoke to you, take a moment to carry it with you. Share it with someone who may be holding on too tightly. And if you want more stories like this, stories about healing, strength, and quiet transformation, stay here. The journey continues.